Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about that 13th district. This show really circulates pretty much in central Illinois.
Right.
And where is that?
Well, typically the way I describe it is it's where the Museum of Science and Industry is, because everybody who's visited Chicago pays a visit to that area, Museum of Science and Industry. But it encompasses Hyde Park, which includes the University of Chicago, South Shore, which is adjoining largely middle-class African-American community, all along the lake, and then it runs west all the way out into Midway Airport. So it's a very diverse district. It's got some relatively well-to-do areas in it, including Hyde Park. It's got some very poor neighborhoods like Inglewood. And part of what makes it interesting and exciting to represent the district is I think that it captures the great diversity that exists in the city of Chicago. We've got whites, blacks, Hispanics. We've got an increasing Palestinian community over on the west side of the district, Lithuanian contingent over on the west side of the district. So there are a lot of diverse interests that I need to represent, and I think that makes it an interesting district to come out of.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. What brings you to this point in your life?
Right. Well, I am not a Chicago native. I actually came to Chicago after college because I was interested in community organizing. I was one of those idealistic kids caught in a 60s time warp, even though it was the 80s, and so decided to look around for a community organizing job. There were a group of churches in Chicago that were interested in hiring somebody to help the Calumet region, where there had been a lot of steel plant closings and there was great unemployment and problems in the area. And so I worked there for 3 years, went back to law school, but my heart was very attached to Chicago, and I continued to be interested in public interest work. So after I got out of law school, I worked as a civil rights attorney, did some political work, organized something called Project Vote, which was a major voter registration drive in 1992. We registered over 100,000 new voters, mostly minority and low-income voters. And given that interest, when this seat came up, some folks asked me if I'd be interested in running, and I went ahead and gave it a shot. Partly because I think that a lot of the action right now really is in state politics. With devolution, the federal government is increasingly providing the states more responsibility and greater latitude in shaping social policy. And so I think this is a wonderful laboratory to work in.
You make it sound very ideal.
Uh-huh.
As a social activist, and a guy who cares about people who are down, what does that make you concerned about with the opportunities in the state legislature?
Well, you know, my top priorities when I came down here, I think, are priorities for a lot of your viewers. I think that education ends up being an absolute priority for the people in my district. The Chicago Public Schools historically have not done a great job in preparing our young people for the jobs of the future. I think that we've made tremendous progress in the last couple of years, particularly on the administrative side, eliminating some of the waste, tightening things up. But I think what's going on in the classroom is still a problem. Young people still aren't performing at a level that makes them competitive globally. So I think that continues to be a major issue. And part of that is funding, and part of it is also creating mechanisms of accountability for teachers, for parents, for students, so that everybody is interested in a good product at the end, which should be young people who can read and write and perform at a level that they need to compete in the economy. So that's a major concern. I was very interested in welfare reform coming down because the year I came down, 1996, was the year that the state of Illinois had to design its new welfare program in the wake of the federal new federal law ending welfare as we know it, and I was fortunate to be able to be one of the major negotiators with the Republicans to design a program that I think ended up being one of the better ones in the country. I'm particularly interested, I think, at this point in the wake of welfare reform in issues concerning the working poor, and I define that fairly liberally. I mean, I think when you've got families of four who are making $30,000, $40,000, may not be classified as poor, but they're struggling. And so a lot of the legislation that I look at now is designed to think about how can we help them. These are folks who are working, they're playing by the rules, but they're still struggling. And so when you look at issues like daycare, health care for the uninsured, a lot of people who are working full-time, maybe 2 or 3 jobs, still don't have health insurance. I think that is a major issue. Tax equity. We continue in the state of Illinois to have one of the more regressive tax systems, and that ends up really putting a pinch on folks at the lower income brackets. So I think there are a whole host of issues that I'd like to see moving in the legislature, but as you know, it's slow going.
Well, I was going to say that the Illinois General Assembly isn't usually known as a hotbed of social activism. How do you find that frustrating? How do you work at
Right.
the issues that you care about?
You know, my impression so far being in the legislature is that people down here really sincerely want to represent their constituents. I think there's a lot of cynicism about Springfield. Some of it is justified, and I think a lot of it is unjustified. I think my impression is that the vast majority of legislators want to do the right thing, but they're also concerned about politics, and they want to preserve their seats. What that means is if you can create programs that are not too risky for legislators. For example, on welfare reform, if you can argue to some of my Republican colleagues that if we set up programs like Work Pays, which provides additional money for welfare recipients who are working to give them an increased incentive to work, they can keep more of their paycheck without losing their welfare benefits. A program like that uses market incentives can be sold to Republican constituencies as a smart way to get people off welfare. If you can create programs like that that they can sell to their district, then oftentimes they're open to doing the right thing. I think what is difficult is when you propose programs in this environment that cost a lot of money. The fiscal constraints that exist in the state, even at a time of surplus, are considerable. I think everybody is looking for a little bit more money. Corporations want more tax breaks. State employees want pay raises. You're always battling in terms of how you're dividing the pie, and oftentimes it's those people who are least organized, and that tends to be the working poor and the folks that I talked about, who are least represented in that process. And that can be frustrating when we start getting to budget issues. A lot of times I think our priorities as a state don't reflect, I think, the interests of the majority of the citizens.
I hear you avoiding the term entitlement, and that the older approach, which was to seek entitlements,
Right.
Has become unpopular, but
Right.
you're looking to combine them with market mechanisms.
Well, I think that when I talk to my district, which has a lot of low-income persons,
But working people.
but working people, I think that everybody thinks that work is better than welfare. I think that is a consensus in this country, and I think that the Republicans deserve some credit for raising up that issue. I think to some degree we lost our focus. I always tell people that when you look at Dr. King's speech in 1963 in the March on Washington, people tend to remember that it was the March for Justice. But if you look at the organizers, like A. Philip Randolph, that was a march for jobs and not just justice. And I think that historically, the movement to give people jobs and the right to a living wage has always been a running thread in what I guess would be considered the left. I think in the 60s we lost focus because people started thinking more in terms of welfare rights and entitlements and working through the courts. Now, I'm a constitutional lawyer, and I believe that the courts can accomplish a lot of things, but I think when it comes to issues of how we lift folks up out of poverty, that emphasizing issues of work, emphasizing issues of responsibility are entirely appropriate. I think the main problem that we have right now in a district like mine is that people don't have access to jobs, or they don't have the skills that prepare them to get the jobs that do exist, or they don't have the transportation mechanisms that would allow them to access the jobs that are being created up in the northern suburbs. And so I think that to the extent that we as policymakers can create programs, whether it's job training, healthcare subsidies, daycare, transportation vouchers, that facilitate people moving into jobs, that's always going to be not only more politically popular than welfare, but I think in long term it's also going to be better for the people who are working.
You're a legislator. We want always try to educate our listeners to the processes.
Right.
You're on the Judiciary Committee.
Yep.
You're on the Public Health and Welfare Committee.
Right.
You're on the Revenue Committee.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about your activities in those committees and what you accomplish in the committee setting.
Well, you know, the committees are really where the action is in Springfield. That's something that I learned, particularly given that now we have rules in the legislature that don't allow amendments on the floor. Very little of the substantive debate on issues takes place on the Senate or the House floor. Most of the substantive debate and the changes take place in committee, before or after committee. That's where the negotiations take place. That's where a lot of the weaknesses are discerned in the bills that are presented. That's where lobbyists may come back and offer amendments that would make it more palatable to members of the committee. So that's really where the action is. Public health and welfare obviously concerns itself mostly with issues of welfare, health, the Department of Human Services, public aid, a whole host of those issues. The Revenue Committee is primarily concerned with taxation, where we're raising our money. And so I've been very interested in that committee, primarily because of my interest, as I said, in creating greater tax equity in the state. And the Judiciary Committee is where we hammer out issues related to crime, and as well as the civil law. On all those committees, I have certain frustrations being in the minority. It's always better being in the majority. And so, just to give you an example, on the Judiciary Committee, we see a lot of bills in committee that purport to be tough on crime, but probably are not particularly intelligent or designed to actually reduce crime, but are more designed to make a particular colleague of mine look good in the upcoming election. And fortunately, we have a Republican chair who's very fair and very thoughtful, Carl Hawkinson, who chairs the Judiciary Committee. And oftentimes in committee we can bottle up some of the more egregious demagoguery that often takes place around issues of crime. But that can still be a very frustrating committee to be on.
I want to come back to that revenue matter that you raised, because it's an enduring one.
Right.
We are, and most Illinoisans perhaps wouldn't acknowledge this explicitly, but we're really a low-tax state.
Right, very much so.
And this is a problem I assume you're thinking of long-term that you seek to address. What's the direction of your thinking about changes in revenue legislation?
Well, part of it, I think, is the mix of taxes that we as a state rely on. Illinois is a low-tax state in the sense that we have a very low flat income tax,
Right.
much lower than many of our neighboring states. And also it's a flat tax. And so that keeps our income taxes relatively low. And on April 15th, when you're looking at those big federal bills, usually you look at your state bill and you're relatively happy in comparison. But we have great reliance on property taxes, and we also have a big reliance on sales taxes. And as a consequence, we tend to have a regressive system that relies a lot on those taxes that the poor and the wealthy both have to pay, as opposed to the income tax where the more you make, the more you pay. I would tend to favor a greater emphasis on the income tax because I think over the long term it's more equitable. And it would also capture some of the tremendous gains in income that people have made over these last 10 years in the booming economy. I'd also probably like to introduce some slight progressivity in the income tax. And I know that people at the federal level, like Steve Forbes, have floated the flat tax at the federal level, and I think that the flat tax has some things to commend for it. It's simple to administer. But I think that for a family of four making $30,000 a year to be paying the same rate as a family of four making $300,000 a year is probably not equitable. And I think that we could create a system that would not put a big pinch on the wealthy in this state, but would provide some relief to those folks who are making a little bit less. And I think that's the kind of fairness that makes sense to most folks in Illinois.
One of the things that the sales tax doesn't cover very well is services.
Yeah.
And we're an increasingly service-oriented economy.
That's exactly right. I mean, in Chicago, that's where all the action is. And I will say, as a lawyer and as a consequence, a member of the service profession, that many of my colleagues in the law and accounting and banking resist vigorously any thought of extending the sales tax to services. But I think that that's probably a direction that we should move in. There's no reason why those people who are purchasing such services shouldn't have to pay the same sort of taxes as somebody who's buying a loaf of bread in the supermarket.
Let's turn our attention to your constituents.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of constituents expect service from their legislator, the kind of little solving problems with government, which we call casework.
Right.
How much of your time and effort goes into that activity?
You know, we spend a lot of time on that, partly because historically a lot of the casework in Chicago was done by the aldermen. And so the state legislators didn't have as much responsibility for doing that unless somebody was dealing directly with the state agency. Increasingly, though, what I find at least is that the aldermanic organizations are not as strong as they used to be. And a lot of times we use our office essentially as a clearinghouse, not just for state services that are provided, but for people who are looking for some sort of government help. So if somebody needs something on Social Security, we'll refer them to the right direction. Somebody needs some help on their house doesn't have electricity, we'll provide help on that. I think that's one of the more gratifying responsibilities actually of being a legislator, is being able to provide some direct help to people in a no-nonsense way, cutting through some bureaucratic red tape. I enjoy the fact that in my office, if we call any organ of government in the state, they will generally answer our phone, answer our call, and we can help our constituents avoid a lot of time and trouble.
That's interesting because you come out of a kind of an independent Democrat tradition, and in the good old, bad old days, sometimes you'd get shut out of that kind of service from the city or the county. Right. But you find them helpful. Well,
you know, I think that the environment of politics in Chicago has changed. I think that when there was the strong machine, oftentimes just getting simple service like garbage pickup was dependent on how supportive you were of that machine. I think that there has been a professionalization of City Hall. I think there has been a professionalization of most of the offices in government, and I think that's been a good thing. I think that generally you can access services for basic stuff just by calling the office and making sure that they're doing their job properly. I think that where the problems still come in have to do with issues of politics and controversy around, let's say, development issues. That's oftentimes where the insiders still have great advantages over the outsiders, and if you're independent, oftentimes you may clash with those offices around particular development issues that are coming up in the community.
Part of the old machine was in the African American community. Yep. And one of your predecessors some years ago gave me kind of an interesting statement, and I want to share it with you if I can. This was from Senator Richard Newhouse a few years ago. And he said to me that the Chicago Democratic Party had something of a formula for choosing black candidates. Quote, "The extent of one's future in the party is directly related to the absence of loyalty to the community. He who sells out at the lowest cost has the brightest future." That's kind of a harsh indictment, and yet I understand where he was coming from. How would you judge that in the current context?
Well, as I said, I think things have changed a little bit, but not as much as they need to. I think Richard Newhouse, a wonderful man who's a constituent of mine and a neighbor, was right at the time, that oftentimes African American leaders were handpicked from above as opposed to coming up from the grassroots. I think that changed with Harold Washington, and I think that changed with a lot of the 60s and 70s movements that occurred. And I also think it changed because the machine changed. I don't think that you have as tight control in terms of who moves up and who moves down. I think that what remains true is that if you want to be an independent Democrat who challenges the status quo, then you are going to have some problems with the insiders. I mean, I still think that there is a difference in culture between the insiders and the outsiders, and I try to be an outsider who can work with the insiders.
Okay.
and not go out of my way to embarrass them just for purely political reasons. But I think that on issues of substance, sometimes there are going to be differences, and that may cost you some political support among the insiders. I also think that probably the biggest thing that's changed is the cost of campaigns these days. I think an independent, like let's say Peter Fitzgerald, who did not have the support of the Republican machine, can essentially purchase an election if you've got enough money. And I think that what's changed, particularly in statewide offices now, is that money, as opposed to just organization, is the currency for winning elections. And I think that is something that I'm very troubled with. In some ways, it's more pernicious than the machine, because the machine at least had some relationship to people and the grassroots. For all the complaints about patronage, at least there was some direct connection between the guy who was working the precinct and the political apparatus. These days, essentially in Chicago, somebody who's running for mayor can have relationships with bond traders, lawyers, the well-organized unions, and not have much support in the grassroots, and potentially still win simply by virtue of running television advertisements. And I think that's an unhealthy thing for the democracy.
A bigger problem than we're going to solve this morning.
I suspect so.
Let me turn to something else. You're an author. Your book is entitled Dreams from My Father, The Story of Race and Inheritance.
Right.
Usually heritage books are written by people a little older than you are.
Right.
By people like me. What moved you to address this at such an early age?
Right. Well, as I mentioned in my foreword, I had the good fortune of attending Harvard Law School. I did fairly well there and was elected president of the Harvard Law Review, and that was a big thing because I was the first African American, and so I got some publicity, and some publishers approached me about possibly writing a book. Given how difficult it is to get a book published when you finally write it, when somebody comes to you and says, listen, we'll actually publish your book if you write one, I figured I might as well go ahead and do it. And I had been thinking for a while about writing a book about my family. It's somewhat unusual. I got my name from my father, who's Kenyan. My mother was from Kansas. That's where I got my accent from. And so their story of a white American and a black African and my growing up, I thought was relevant to the issues of race that we face in this country and we often face in Illinois. So hopefully it provided some insight for people into how we might resolve, or at least think about and work through some of the racial dilemmas that continue to face our country.
Well, as somebody who has read the book, I want to say that it's a remarkably mature analysis for a person of your
tender years.
Length of life. That's right.
There you go. Thank you.
Are you writing anything right now?
I have not had time this past couple years to write anything, but I'm thinking that I may spend next summer writing something having to do with public policy.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do still continue to do some writing. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago at the law school. I teach constitutional law and civil rights law. And so oftentimes I'm writing articles on legal issues that are coming up, and I may combine my interest in politics and law to write something a little more academic than the last piece that I wrote.
Writing is a solitary job.
It is.
Politics, state senator, is a very social activist kind of a thing. how do you keep these two sides of Barack Obama in balance?
Well, you know, I think that's one of the benefits of having you know, your feet in a bunch of different worlds. You know, I can let my extrovert side come out when I'm down in Springfield. When I'm down in Chicago, when I'm up in Chicago, I can and sit down and reflect on some of the experiences that happened down here. There's wonderful stories, obviously, down in Springfield, and wonderful characters. And I think that the political experience down in Springfield truly gives a face to a lot of the abstract arguments that we have about politics. Illinois is a wonderful microcosm for the country as a whole. It's north-south, it's urban, rural, it's black-white, and so being here down in Springfield, I think, gives you a wonderful lens through which to view a lot of the issues that we face in this country as a whole, and it's a terrific thing to write about when I've got a little more time.